Goedemiddag iedereen. Welkom op ons webinar over export VK met focus op visa. Mijn naam is Ilke Blikkie, ik ben Brexit-coördinator bij FIT. Het grootste deel van deze sessie zal gegeven worden door Charlotte Hall, die bij ons inbelt vanuit het Verenigd Koninkrijk. De Brexit betekende het einde van het vrij verkeer van diensten en van personen. En een van de gevolgen daarvan is dat u, als u diensten wil gaan uitvoeren in het Verenigd Koninkrijk, dat u in sommige gevallen een visum zal nodig hebben. Het doel van dit webinar is dan ook om uit te leggen wanneer en in welke gevallen dit nodig is en of u onder een van die uitzonderingsmaatregelen kan vallen. Na de sessie van Charlotte, die ongeveer een uur zal duren, zal ik nog kort ook de Brexit-subsidies toelichten die u nog altijd kan aanvragen bij FIT. Vragen die kan u ondertussen stellen in de chat. U kan als u die in het Engels stelt, dan kan Charlotte die direct meelezen. Als u zich niet comfortabel voelt in het Engels, dan stelt u de vraag in het Nederlands, dan zullen wij het vertalen. En zoals gezegd overlopen wij dan de vragen op het einde van de sessie. Indien de vraag te specifiek is, want dat kan in deze materie wel eens gebeuren, dat dat een hele specifieke, bedrijfsspecifieke vraag is, dan zullen wij het antwoord uitgebreid voor u opzoeken na de sessie en dan zullen wij u na de sessie een antwoord bezorgen. But now then I will give the floor to Charlotte, who joins us today from the UK. So the floor is yours, Charlotte.
Hello, everybody. It's lovely to meet you all. So I'm going to chat you through some of the key considerations for UK immigration in this post-Brexit era that we find ourselves in. By way of short introduction, we've got an agenda on the screen. So we're going to look at working in the UK, what that involves from an immigration perspective, the key components of what we consider business travel and business visits, a couple of the sponsored visa categories, so the most common categories used to facilitate employment in the UK, including a bit of an overview on the sponsor license process, which is the process that's involved in sponsorship and securing that from an employer perspective, and an overview of the skilled worker and business mobility routes. Again, both of those are sponsored worker visas, but the most common to facilitate employment in the UK that is driven by a working relationship. So I guess I can start at the beginning. If we could move on to the next slide, please. And the next one. So first of all, when we're considering moving somebody to the UK for work purposes, our biggest consideration should be whether or not that individual has the permission to undertake the activity planned. Now, obviously, in a post-Brexit era for EU nationals, that's a significant sea change and mind shift. Prior to Brexit, this probably was the last consideration when moving people into the UK, because the right to work was de facto and was confirmed. Now, this is not the case automatically, and it does need to be a very high consideration. The UK does not currently have formalised regulations covering cross-border remote working for EU nationals or indeed any other, and therefore any individual seeking entry to the UK for work and employment purposes must have the lawful right to do so. Importantly, there is a fundamental distinction between being permitted to enter and being permitted to work in the UK, and those two things are not the same. If an activity falls out of the scope of the business visitor rules, and there are a number of activities that are permitted that I will spend some time chatting with you about today, an individual will more than likely require work permission in the form of a formal visa application. Applications for work permission must be made from outside of the UK and prior to travel. It's not something that can be switched into from within the UK. So if an individual seeks entry as a visitor, i.e. they come in perhaps on a French passport, enter the UK for purposes of visiting, and then realise they need a work permit, it's not an application that can be obtained on the ground. The individual would need to leave the UK, make the formal application at the appropriate authority, and then come back in again. So that is an important consideration as well. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So this is an overview of all of the available routes. It is not, as you can see, the most straightforward system. We have a number of different categories and a number of different options that are available depending on individuals' circumstances and their personal requirements. So there are personal and business immigration routes available. The routes in yellow are the most commonly used to facilitate employment. So we've got work-sponsored visas that require a job offer or an employer in the UK, and we've got some that are independent of that scheme. There are other routes available, which are the items in black that you can see on the screen, for example, frontier workers or charity workers, and domestic workers and things like that, ministers of religion, but those are very specific to an individual's circumstances, and there are different eligibility components in place for each of them. It's always worth exploring all of the routes available to an individual before going down the sponsored visa route, but more often than not, we will see moving forwards that sponsorship remains the most viable and the most popular route. So as we move on, I think it's most important to discuss business travel first, because this is something that often triggers the need for work permission. So if we can move along a little bit further, that's it, thank you. An individual planning to enter the UK as a visitor must comply with the visitor rules. Now, there are two different sets of rules. One's for those entering as tourists or general visitors, and those entering as business visitors. As a business visitor, you're technically defined as a person coming to the UK to carry out a permitted business activity, and you must not intend to take employment or work productively in the UK. As a general rule, working productively is deemed to be productive or hands-on activities for the benefit of a UK company or an organisation, or indeed for the benefit of your home country where those activities themselves are not permitted. Productive activities is not defined specifically, which again makes this all the more complicated, but is typically deemed to be an activity that would constitute a traditional employment function of a given role, or have a productive output or a deliverable that is provided or obtained in the UK. A visitor in any capacity cannot spend more than 180 days in any 12-month rolling period in the UK, and it's important that that condition is adhered to. So again, that's something to consider. If you've got individuals coming in and out of the UK regularly, they need to ensure that their total cumulative stay does not exceed the 180 days in a 12-month rolling period. With a few rare exceptions, a visitor should not receive a payment from a UK source unless it's just reasonable expenses associated with the travel, and there certainly shouldn't be in connection with their activities any more than reasonable expenses. And they should not be performing work activities in the UK. And they must be a genuine visitor, and they must have what we consider to be returnability factors, i.e. they must be intending to leave the UK at the end of their visit, and typically if they're making a formal application, they would be required to evidence the reasons that they are, or the ties to the country that they're the sender. So we're looking at employment overseas, property overseas, a general commitment to return to the country in which they're visiting from. And they should not be seeking to live in the UK for extended periods through frequent or successive visits, or be trying to make the UK their main home without seeking the correct work permission. So that's known as de facto residence, and is something that immigration officers will be very keen to rule out when assessing frequent travel to the UK. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So permitted activities in the UK are listed in the immigration rules, which is the legislative framework for the visa permissions in the UK. So typically speaking, we're looking at activities such as attending business meetings and events, giving off one-off or short series of talks and speeches, provided they're not for profit or for payment, negotiation and signing of deals and contracts, attending trade fairs, carrying out site visits and inspections, gathering information associated with the employment overseas, or being briefed on the requirements of a UK customer. So there is quite a lot of flexibility within the scope of the rules in terms of interpretation, but it is important that this is a high consideration when assessing whether or not an individual may seek entry to the UK as a visitor, or whether in fact these activities fall outside of what is permitted in genuine terms, and therefore an employment visa is required. Similarly, client-facing activities are usually fine, so things like introducing your client to a UK colleague, or attending a client pitch for a client already based in the UK, negotiating and signing agreements associated with that, conducting due diligence for clients that cannot be completed in your home country, for example, face-to-face meetings for identification purposes and things like that. Obviously, that lends itself well for the purposes of a visit. Or indeed attending meetings to update clients on your recent research or analysis or work undertaking outside of the UK, where you're simply presenting that in a form to the client and then going back to your country overseas to continue on that work. Intra-corporate activities are also specifically mentioned. So an employee of an overseas-based company can advise and consult or troubleshoot and provide training, sharing skills and knowledge on internal projects with UK employees of their same corporate group. So essentially UK-based colleagues, provided they are not working directly with clients and having a productive output while they're here. And for those in financial services, internal audits may be conducted within the UK, provided it's within the same group of companies as your employment overseas. So those are just examples. It's not an exhaustive list, but it does give you a bit of an idea and flavour of what can fall within the business visit rules. Next slide, please. So we've also got a few more here. So we've got things like training, technology and systems testing and installation is permitted as a visitor, and manufacturing goods, supply and services. So employees may come and install or dismantle or repair and advise on machinery and equipment, computer software or hardware, where there is an overarching contract of purchase with a UK company. And either the overseas sending company is the manufacturer or the supplier, or is part of a contractual arrangement for after-sales service. So again, there are concessions there that can be utilised. Delivery of goods and persons and cabotage is also specifically covered in the business visitor rules. And export companies also have concessions within the framework. Now, importantly, for most EU nationals, you'll be considered non-visa nationals, which means that you don't need to obtain entry clearance in the form of a visa to enter the UK as a visitor, and that hasn't changed post-Brexit. So most EU nationals, unless there's an immigration issue or a reason to the contrary, depending on the individual's personal circumstances, would usually be able to board the flight, enter the UK and pass through immigration control without having to make a formal application from overseas. That does not excuse the population from compliance with the rules. It just means that the purpose of their visit is effectively not tested until they meet the immigration officer at the port of arrival, where they would typically then be asked questions to verify the purpose of their visit, and they would need to fall within these activities. So it's just to clarify that for you. Next slide, please. So we have prohibited activities listed here. Now, again, it's not exhaustive, but just to give you some examples and some ideas. So trading in any capacity, covering core leave, maternity leave, or staff shortages, periods of absence by an overseas colleague would absolutely not be permitted, because that, in a sense, is deemed to be productive work and would require work permission even for a very short period. Working remotely from the UK, as I alluded to earlier, is not specifically covered, and there is no legislative framework to cut for it. Effectively, it's only permitted where minor instances, for example, answering your emails or taking a call during a visit for another purpose, are incidental to the main purpose of the visit. So we are looking at really minor occurrences where remote working would be considered, and it is certainly a breach of the immigration rules to seek to remote work from the UK for a period of time where effectively you are just sitting and working, sitting at a desk or otherwise delivering services for your overseas employer, but from within the UK. That would be considered a breach, even if the productive output is associated with the overseas sending office. Delivering any aspect of BAU activities on a project or a client contract would also be considered productive work and therefore prohibited. Attending conferences as an organizer where you're being paid to do so, delivering training where you're being paid to do so and it's external to your corporate group. Overseeing performance and operations of staff is generally considered a productive work activity where that is a core function of your employment, and the same with financial performances and analysis in that capacity. So again, there are exceptions and justifications that we can look at for each of these, but broadly speaking, these activities should all be placing red flags in terms of permissibility, and we should be looking at working visas if these activities are required. Okay, so assuming that we've looked at all of these activities and we can't find a way of making the visitor rules fit for the particular circumstances, we then have to move on to work-sponsored categories. Now, broadly speaking, as I said before, we're genuinely looking at sponsored visa categories where an individual does not have a personal immigration route available to them or can benefit from one of the non-sponsored routes. So I'm going to take some time just to talk through the sponsored visa categories, because it is a lot, and it is also something that is critical to most employment and something that's relatively new to the EU population post-Brexit. We can move on one slide, please. And the next one. Oh, I think we might have missed a slide. Can we just go back to the sponsor license route? Oh, there seems to be a slide missing, but we'll just keep chatting anyway. So in order to hold a sponsor license, we need to first establish whether or not the company is established in the UK. So we're looking at a footprint. So we have two potential options. There is an expansion worker route, and there is the core sponsored visa route, so sponsor license requirement. Where a company is already established in the UK, and they have a trading footprint, then the expansion worker visa route is ruled out, and we're looking purely at the sponsorship route under the skilled worker or otherwise. With that, we're talking about whether or not there's a trading presence and whether or not there are employees already in the UK in an office or similar. So in order to proceed with a sponsor license application in the first instance, you would need to be able to demonstrate that you have an appropriate person in a position of responsibility that can take accountability for the sponsorship. So this person is labelled as the authorising officer, and they must either be British or settled, so holding indefinite leave to remain or be free of immigration control. This is the first stumbling block for new companies when they're seeking to sponsor people in the UK, particularly if UK operations are in their infancy. Assuming that you've got someone in a position of authority that can take on this responsibility, so typically we're looking at a head of mobility or a head of HR or someone that would have visibility of the sponsored workforce, we can then move forward with a sponsor license application. Now, a sponsor license application has to be filed before you can proceed to make an entry clearance application for an individual on this basis. There is a register of existing sponsors available on the Home Office website, and you can consult that before proceeding to determine whether or not an individual or a company already has a presence in the UK and has been through this process before. If they have, obviously that simplifies things significantly, but only obviously if that's a part of your corporate group and you're a sender. Assuming that you have checked this already and you're not an existing sponsor, you would need to make an application to become a sponsor to the Home Office. There are two different tranches of visa category available, and what we usually recommend is where both are applicable to your company or your corporate group, that you apply for both in one go, because that simplifies things later down the line. So we have global business mobility, which used to be called the intercompany transfer route, and that enables corporate structures to transfer people from one corporate entity based outside the UK into the other corporate entity, and vice versa. So it gives a bit of flexibility there. It's designed for fixed-term transfers or short-term roles and coverage, and does not lead to permanent residence in the UK, and is not for those roles that would be considered to be displacing the UK workforce, but does provide large corporate entities with some flexibility. Failing that, or indeed if you don't have a large corporate presence, the next route is the skilled worker route. So this is by far and away the most popular with applicants and individuals, because this leads to settlement or permanent residence in the UK. The skilled worker route does have additional requirements, so is not for the faint-hearted in that respect, but certainly yields the better outcome for the individual. But there is a requirement to demonstrate that there is a genuine vacancy in the UK business for the role that you're seeking to fill with a migrant worker. Because the concept of this visa is that you're effectively plugging a vacancy or a gap in the workforce in the UK already that couldn't naturally be filled by somebody already based here. In order to proceed with a skilled worker visa, we first need to establish the licence quantity. So we need to look at the setup of the business in the UK. So we're looking at demonstrating its presence, i.e. Whether or not it needs to be listed on any kind of stock exchanges, or whether it is registered to pay the appropriate taxes, and indeed whether or not it has a premises, so lease and things like that. You have to submit at least 4 documents. If you have more of the core documents, then great, but it is a minimum of 4, and it is typically some of the documents I've highlighted. So we're looking at certificates of incorporation, leases of business premises, registration with HMRC for tax and payment of VAT and PAYE if necessary, or national insurance contributions, business plans, evidence of corporate structure, employer's liability certificates to show valid insurance policies in place. So again, quite a document-heavy application, and not always quick to obtain those documents depending on the nature and structure of your organisation. Once you've assembled the application documentation, it's necessary to file the application online. Now, this can be managed by a vendor such as ourselves, or you can do this independently. What is important is that when the application itself is submitted, it is submitted from your own IP address. So your vendor cannot submit the application for you. You have to do it yourself, but they can obviously talk you through the process. So the application form is prepared online. You have to provide references to things like your PAYE and your HMRC reference numbers, confirm which documents you're uploading, and provide the entities and addresses for all of your corporate offices if you wish to use them for the purposes of global visibility in the future. So again, quite an onerous application, quite document heavy, but worthwhile doing right in the first instance to ensure that you're set up correctly. There are two different application fees payable, one for large organisations and one for small organisations or those with charitable status. Again, worth considering where your business would fit and largely depending on your corporate structure as to which will be applicable. Once the application is ready to submit and you've got all of the supporting documents required, this needs to be submitted online and a submission sheet is generated. That needs to be signed off by the person that will assume the role of authorising officer that I mentioned before, and that person ultimately takes responsibility for the management of your sponsored workforce in the UK. So if you were found to be employing somebody illegally, it would be that person that would be held to account, and that does carry personal and corporate responsibility and punishments and penalties. So it's a very serious responsibility. The supporting documents are then shared with the Home Office by email, and the standard processing time for this kind of application is broadly around 8 weeks. There is a lottery system available to expedite, and you have to pay an additional fee and enter a lottery each morning to try to secure a priority place. Assuming you are successful and you have to resubmit the request every day, then you can reduce the consideration time down to 10 business days from the date that you're accepted onto the scheme. So again, it's all about forward planning with this kind of application if you're not set up already, because it's not typically something that can be guaranteed in a short time frame and will really impact business operations if you're not managing that proactively. Once the application is approved, you'll be issued with the login information to the sponsor management portal and be able to log in and review your licence and the numbers of certificates of sponsorship that have been awarded as part of your submission. A certificate of sponsorship is, for all intents and purposes, a work permit, and it has to contain the details of the role that you're seeking to sponsor, so typically a job description, an indication of the salary to be paid, and the work dates that you intend to issue the work permit or certificate of sponsorship for. For individuals seeking entry from outside the UK, you have to submit that portion to the Home Office first. They will validate it, confirm the role itself is suitable for sponsorship, and then confirm to you by return. That process itself usually takes 1 to 2 business days. Once that process is in place, you can then proceed to assign that certificate to the individual you have in mind, and then you add their personal information to the form. If we could just move along one slide, please. And then the next one. Thank you. So the skilled worker route, again, as I said, is the most popular because it leads to settlement in the UK, but is the one with the heaviest restrictions and the heaviest documentary requirements. So an individual has to hold a job offer from a registered sponsor in the UK. So we're assuming now that we've been through the sponsor license process, and the job must be at what we call RQF level 6. So essentially you're looking at jobs that either require degree level qualification or similar industry experience, or are managerial level with supervisory responsibilities. Applicants are required to satisfy an English language requirement, which for EU nationals can be a bit of a headache just in terms of timing. So you can either evidence that you've satisfied English language by relying on a degree level qualification that was taught in English, so either taught in English overseas or taught in English in the UK, whichever is applicable. If the qualification was taught in English overseas, then a further verification step of that qualification is required with an organisation called UK ECTIS. That typically takes another 10 business days, although there are fast track options if you need them to expedite their consideration, and that sits outside of the government. Assuming that you don't have an English language degree level qualification, then the next natural position is to take an English language test. The UK government partners with IELTS and other reputable testing organisations to issue its own specific English language test. And it's really important that the correct test is selected. They must be what the UK government considers secure. So they're labelled as UKVI, so UK Visas and Immigration Secure English Language Tests, which is SELT. If you sit an IELTS test, even if it is at the correct level, but it is not the UKVI SELT test, it will not be accepted and the individual will need to resit the test, which again can really impact lead time for businesses and is really frustrating for the applicant as well. For the purposes of completing a test, they must meet level B1. So that has different scoring criteria depending on the test that you use, but it must cover all 4 components of English, of language, so speaking, listening, reading and writing. The role itself also has to have a minimum salary of 26,200 per annum, and also SOC code thresholds apply. So for those not familiar with what a SOC code is, the UK Office of National Statistics has coded every single role available for employment based on skill level. And each role category has been given a minimum salary threshold. So although the minimum salary for the category is £26,200 a year, the SOC code, depending on the type of role, so for example, whether it's a dentist or a CEO or an engineer or an analyst, will have a different qualifying salary, and the salary must meet both components. If it doesn't, the application will be refused. There is now also greater flexibility to switch into this category from within the UK, which wasn't there previously. So in the old days, where the category was called Tier 2 General, if you were in the ICT, as it was then known, route, you could not switch into Tier 2 General even if your business considerations changed, whereas that is now no longer the case. So if you have brought somebody into the UK as a global business mobility migrant, i.e. they were here on a fixed term transfer for a short period, but now that the landscape in your organisation has changed, it's possible to switch them into the skilled worker route, which gives them a pathway to settlement. Now, they cannot use the time they spent in the global business mobility route as part of their qualification, but at least puts them on the right path and allows you to offer or localise them as appropriate. So it is a bit more flexible, taking into account some feedback from businesses. And as I discussed before, there is a genuine vacancy requirement because you are effectively deemed to be displacing a UK or settled worker by bringing in someone to a sponsored visa holder. The standard processing time is 15 working days from the date of a biometric appointment, but EU nationals can benefit from the newly released ID app. So the government, as part of its Brexit readiness, unveiled this process to facilitate and to streamline the applications they were going to be receiving from EU nationals. So the biggest difference is that the individual doesn't need to attend a visa application centre and pay an additional fee to submit their biometric information, which is their fingerprints and their digital photo. Instead, they use their smartphone to take a selfie, it's all very modern, and verify their identity using the biometric chip in their passport. Assuming both components are successful, the individual can then submit their application online in its entirety through their app and through the online application that is generated, and they receive a decision electronically, which is automatically coded to their passport. An EU national will then not receive an endorsement or a sticker in their passport, but the status will be linked digitally to their profile and visible to an immigration officer on arrival in the UK, thus streamlining the application process for this population. If the application route doesn't work, so for example, if the biometric chip is damaged or the individual owns an older smartphone or one that's not compatible with the app, they can still proceed in the sort of more old-fashioned way and attend a biometric appointment, but typically you're adding on another week or so of lead time depending on the location of the individual, because they'll need to factor in biometric appointment and their attendance. It is possible to pay to have your visa processed faster. So standard processing times are 15 working days, but if you purchase priority services, you can reduce this to 5 to 7 working days in most cases. And in some locations, there is a super priority service available, which brings it down further to 24 to 48 hours. Again, at an additional cost. What we do advise is that the lead time for an application is set with your businesses at 8 to 10 weeks, from initiating a vendor, if using one, to the start date of the individual, because you have to factor in a number of components, such as availability for English language tests, appointment availability if necessary, and the availability of documentation from the individual and the corporate group. So it's just to bear that in mind. There is an immigration skills charge applicable for this visa category, which, depending on the size of the sponsor, is charged at £1,000 a year for most or for large sponsors. So that's a significant cost to the employer, and that cannot be passed on to the individual. You can issue a certificate of sponsorship for up to 3 years or up to 5 years in one go. So then obviously the cost is extrapolated out accordingly. There is also an immigration health surcharge that is payable to enable access to the National Health Service. And for adults at the moment, that's charged at £624 a year. So we are looking at considerable visa fees as opposed to some other comparable countries. And again, there is an option to qualify for settlement subject to availability, which makes this route very attractive to most individuals. And individuals can bring their family members, so dependent spouses and children under 18 with them as part of the visa, and they have the right to work and study in the UK, again, making it quite attractive to family groups. We could move on to the next slide, please. So this again is just an overview of the process. So from end to end, just for your visibility. So we're looking at compliance and sponsorship at the beginning, so identification of the candidate, an assessment of available routes, sponsorship, and requesting the relevant certificate of sponsorship from the government. TB testing varies depending on location, so if it's an identified country requiring that, then that's another additional step that has to be built into process. And the same with English language requirements. So those two variables are typically the ones we see pushing out the end-to-end process, depending on where the individual is and their nationality and their location. Important to clarify that if individuals are third country nationals, they can only make an application for a UK visa from a country where they hold either citizenship or legal residence. So they can't make an application for a country where they're already in that country as a visitor. So if you're looking at, for example, a US national who is visiting France, they would need to go back to the US to file the application from the US because they cannot make the application in France if they don't hold residency in France. So again, just another factor, another layer when considering the application timeline for your population. Attending a biometric appointment, if applicable. Obviously, there's a lead time associated with that, and it's not applicable in all circumstances, but assuming that it is, that's usually your marker for when the government will consider processing applications. So you may have submitted the application a week or so before this date, but the government will not begin its processing times, or at least the calculation of them, until the individual has submitted their biometric information. So when we talk about the 15 working days, it is from the date of this point, if they have to attend an appointment, or the date of electronic submission if they've used the app. If they've been to a biometric appointment, they will receive a visa in their passport, and they will need to submit their passports for the consideration period. If they've used the app and the digital process, they don't. They'll just receive an email notification once the visa has been issued. And individuals can then proceed to enter the UK. Now, in all visa applications, the application forms themselves require you to list the date of travel. The date of travel can be earlier than the work start date that's listed on the certificate of sponsorship, but this is the very earliest the UK visa authorities will issue the visa from. So if an individual lists the 1st of March as their travel date and their start date is the 10th of March, then the 1st of March is the date that the government should issue the visa from, but you cannot change that once you've submitted your application. So if the visa is actually approved on the 25th of February, the individual cannot enter the UK until the 1st of March on that visa. If they do so, they are entering as a visitor and do not have the right to work. This is a common pitfall that we see with EU nationals because there's no physical document in their passport. They assume that once the visa is issued, they can hop on the plane and come across to the UK. Now, whilst they can absolutely do that as a visitor, they do not have working rights, and those working rights must be activated by entering the UK in the correct visa capacity. So you can't just remain in the UK as a visitor and assume that your working rights kick in from activation of your visa. That's not how the government works. So it does require some planning and foresight and ensuring that your individuals do understand the difference. If individuals have used haven't used the digital process and have gone to a biometric appointment, they'll be issued with a sticker in their passport that's valid for 90 days, which allows them to enter the UK for this purpose. Once they get to the UK, they have to collect their biometric residence permit, which details, it's like a little credit card, and that confirms the full duration of their visa as purchased. and then that is the end of that is typically their expiry date. Now, the UK is in some way through the digitisation phase, and all of these biometric residence permits are currently being issued unless they expire beforehand, with end dates of the 31st of December 2024. But the visa permission may well exceed this, and where that is the case, individuals will be notified in June 2024 of what they need to do to update their status documents. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the visa expires on this date, it just means that that status document does. So both dates need to be tracked from an employer compliance perspective. When individuals enter the UK for the first time, on or before their first date of employment, and this is regardless of their citizenship, even British nationals must comply with this requirement, the employer must complete a right to work check. The right to work check means that the employer has evidence and has retained documentation to prove that the individual in question has the right to conduct that work in the UK. And this check must be completed correctly and verified accordingly and kept on file. If the Home Office and the government were to audit, and they do this in the life of a licence, a sponsor, they would expect to see completed and full right to work checks for every employee, including British nationals. So there is a whole different training session on the requirements of the right to work check, but it's a very important component. Could you move on to the next slide, please? So largely this will all be the same, but I've also taken some time just to set out the common categories within global business mobility. So this visa route permits a bit more flexibility, as I chatted to earlier, surrounding the transfer of individuals from one corporate group overseas into the UK. And as you can see on my screen, there are 5 different subheaders. Now, some of them will, and some of them won't be appropriate, depending on your corporate structure. The most common, and the one in the red, is the senior or specialist worker, which effectively replaced the intercompany transfer route, allowing companies to send someone for a fixed term period from one corporate group to the UK to complete an assignment. Now, there's no English language requirement with this visa route, which makes it quicker typically than the skilled worker, but for the same reasons, it doesn't yield a settlement, so it is only designed for fixed term transfers. There are also graduate trainee routes that are available if you have rolling global graduate programs that again allow some flexibility. The expansion worker, secondment worker and service supplier routes are all quite complicated and all quite new. The expansion worker visa route is designed for companies that do not already have a presence in the UK and are wishing to set one up. So we are, depending on how familiar you are, it used to be called an overseas business person's route or something to that, or sole representative of an overseas business person. But effectively, those have both been done away with unless you work in media, and we're now looking at the expansion worker route. Now, for this route to be applicable, you absolutely must not have commenced trading in the UK. If you have, you can't use the route at all, but it effectively allows you to go through a sponsor license light submission, evidencing your intention to establish a business presence in the UK. Now, the documents are still quite onerous, so it's not completely light, but it allows you to effectively bring somebody into the UK who is a non-UK citizen or settled worker to act in the capacity as an authorising officer, and it can be up to 5 people at a time, to set up business operations in the UK. The license is issued for 2 years, and then in that time you have to evidence that your business has been established and begun trading, and then you can convert this license into a full sponsor license and continue as a corporate sponsorship organisation. So it's sort of a stepping stone between completely nothing to a full established trading presence. Secondment worker, again, is a flexible route allowing businesses where they have existing contracts with UK entities to second an individual under that contract into the UK. It is very specific and not widely taken up because the contracts have to be very specific and defined. And the same with the service supplier route. So again, it's open to interpretation, but there are options available for those. The contracts typically have to be very high value, and we're looking at upwards of £50 million for the secondment worker. So it is not always achievable, but again is a route that is available where it can be demonstrated there is a contract of significant worth in place. I've also summarised on the screen minimum salary levels for each one, maximum durations you can spend in the UK, and high level where the English language, immigration, health charges and things like that are applicable. As you will see, in all cases, it is possible to switch out of the categories, so it gives flexibility if circumstances do change. And as you will note, that all of them also are precluded from making ILR applications, but do allow the support of dependents. So that's a whistle-stop tour of this category, but it is quite complicated and would require detailed analysis of individual corporate circumstances before you could determine whether each route was applicable. We do see quite heavy use of the senior or specialist worker route for fixed-term transfers, because it does offer a little bit of flexibility and a little bit of a fast-track option because of the absence of the English language requirement. Then the skilled worker, and also now we have that flexibility to switch people out of this route and into the skilled worker. It gives you sort of a fast track in if you need someone in urgently and your license is already established. And the key for this particular category is to ensure that when you applied for your license, you listed all of your corporate entities. You cannot send someone from an entity that is not listed on your sponsor license. So where there have been mergers and acquisitions and so forth, we need to be updating the sponsor license with the full corporate structure to facilitate ongoing use of the category. In both global business mobility and in the skilled worker, and in fact all sponsored visas, you have a number of obligations to the government to track and report on the migrant population. So we're talking about recruit absences from work that exceed 10 business days, changes to their role or their duties and responsibilities, all must be reported, and there are a number of overarching provisions that you have to have and established protocols that you should have in place. So you should be able to report on the whereabouts of your population. So changes to work location and so forth should be being reported via the SMS system as part of the life of your license and your duties as a sponsor. And again, the overarching responsibility sits with the authorising officer role that I mentioned before. I realise I've spoken a lot. It's an awful lot of information, so I would like to open the floor to some questions shortly, but I believe we can just move on to the next slide, and then that brings us to the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte, for this overview of the different possibilities of when you want to do professional activities in the UK, and what you need to take into account. As told before, I will first briefly explain some financial grants we offer at Flanders Investment and Trade, and then we will go through the Q&A. Thank you very much. Zoals gezegd zal ik nog kort dus onze bijzondere crisissteun internationalisering Brexit toelichten. Zoals gezegd is dit een tijdelijke steunmaatregel gefinancierd door de Europese Unie. Die komt bovenop de reguliere subsidies van FIT, die je dus daarboven nog eens kan aanvragen. Wie komt daarvoor in aanmerking? Dat is een subsidie voor Vlaamse KMO's met minimum 2 voltijdse personeelsleden en we gaan tot maximum 500 personeelsleden. Die subsidie is er niet voor iedereen. Die subsidie is enkel van toepassing voor bedrijven die een negatieve impact ondervinden door de Brexit. Wat zijn de voorwaarden? U dient een handelsrelatie te kunnen aantonen met het Verenigd Koninkrijk voor de Brexit en u moet op een of andere manier een negatieve impact op uw handels- of bedrijfsresultaten kunnen aantonen. Dus dat kan zijn een omzetdaling bijvoorbeeld, maar ook bijvoorbeeld de winstmarges die verkleinen. En u heeft ongetwijfeld ook nog extra kosten door bijvoorbeeld douaneformaliteiten, extra certificatie, etc. Welke kosten komen in aanmerking voor deze subsidie? Dus het gaat zowel over acties die gefinancierd kunnen worden om de Britse markt te heroveren, maar ook als u een negatieve impact zou ondervinden van de Brexit, kan u eigenlijk die negatieve impact ombuigen in iets positiefs door aan exportmarktdiversificatie te doen. Dus door nieuwe klanten te gaan zoeken in andere exportmarkten. De kosten die daarvoor in aanmerking komen zijn bijvoorbeeld reis- en verblijfskosten bij prospectiereizen, maar ook deelname aan beurzen of andere events, maar ook bepaalde kosten in zaken douane, certificatie of extern advies. Als u op een of andere manier extern advies wil krijgen over bepaalde topics, als we blijven bij het thema van dit webinar, dan zou u bijvoorbeeld kunnen nagaan of u bepaalde visa-mogelijkheden eigenlijk... u zou die kunnen nagaan. U zou kunnen nagaan wat de beste route voor u is. En dat extern advies, dat zou je ook via die subsidie kunnen subsidiëren. Wat ook in aanmerking komt, zijn kosten voor internationale bedrijfscommunicatie bijvoorbeeld en ook bepaalde personeelskosten. Eén project kan verschillende initiatieven omvatten, maar opgelet, dit duurt, het Brexit Adjustment Reserve loopt tot het einde van dit jaar. Dat wil zeggen dat u dus nog maar een project kan indienen dat nu start tot het einde van het jaar. De bedragen van die subsidies die ziet u op het scherm. Die zijn afhankelijk van de grootte van de aanvrager. Goed om te weten is dat bij deze subsidies dat wij 90% van de kosten eigenlijk kunnen subsidiëren, waar dat bij reguliere subsidies 50% is. En u kan ook meerdere Brexit-subsidies ontvangen voor verschillende projecten. Bij Flanders Investment and Trade werken we met verschillende oproepen. Er loopt op dit ogenblik een oproep die nog loopt tot 12 april, 17 uur. U ziet het op de slide. Als u nog meer informatie zou wensen, dan kan u terecht op onze website, waar alles nog meer in detail uitgelegd staat. Maar u kan altijd contact opnemen, ofwel met ons, ofwel rechtstreeks met onze collega's van de dienst subsidies. De contactgegevens ziet u ook op de slide. Dus er zijn subsidies voorhanden bij Flanders Investment and Trade met focus vooral op internationalisering. Ook de collega's van Vlaio hebben subsidies voor Brexit geïmpacteerde bedrijven. Zij gaan zich vooral focussen op het aanpassen van bepaalde bedrijfsprocessen. U kan ook zien op de slides dat de voorwaarden voor de begunstigden iets anders zijn. Dus als u niet in aanmerking zou komen bij Flanders Investment and Trade, dan doet u er goed aan om eens te kijken of u wel in aanmerking komt voor de subsidies bij Vlaio. Maar dan stel ik voor dat wij nu even gaan kijken naar de chat en naar de vragen. So Charlotte, we will start with a Q&A right now. We received several questions. Well, let me go back to the start. So the first question comes from Chris, who asks, can a project engineer that performs solely intellectual work be considered as a visitor?
Intellectual work, I'm assuming, are we assuming it's like consultancy? Potentially is the short answer. Without understanding a bit more about the scope and the remit of what they intend to do in the UK, we would need to take a view. But if, generally speaking, an individual's professional capacity overseas is to provide the intellectual oversight, and that's what they'd receive a fee for, and the only change to that is that they're in the UK, then we would consider it productive work generally. Consulting on a specific project sometimes provides flexibility, but it would depend largely on what the individual was doing day to day and what their role and responsibility was overseas.
Okay, thank you. The next question, Kaan. My children and I are Belgian citizens, but my wife has a permanent residence card from Belgium. What should we do if we want to go to the UK for a week? Does she need a visa for a short stay?
Potentially. Again, I can't give specific advice because I don't know enough. But if she is, there's a visa national list on the government website, which confirms whether or not an individual would require a formal visa for visiting and tourist purposes, or whether or not they're considered a non-visa national in the same way that a Belgian citizen is. So that would be your first point of consultation. If they are a non-visa national, then they should be permitted to enter the UK just as yourself and your children are. But if they are a visa national, they would need to make an application first. Holding residence rights in Belgium is not considered sufficient to transfer those into the UK.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of information available on the website of gov.uk too. So there you can click on your nationality and then and the type of work or the type of stay you consider, and there you can also see what the exact requirements are. So always useful to consult the website of gov.uk too. The next question Can a person with a Turkish nationality and a blue card in Belgium enter the UK without a visa for business purposes?
Potentially, yes. So the blue card is not considered relevant for the purposes of the UK. Turkish nationals do usually require visit visas. But again, best to check with the visa nationalist before confirming. And again, it would depend on the nature of the activity rather than their citizenship as to whether or not they need further permission.
Okay, thank you. The next question. So can a person with Afghan nationality and a permanent residence card, F card, from Belgium, along with 4 children and husband, if they are Belgian citizens, visit the UK without? So it's actually the same question. I suppose, we will take this question away and we will come back to you individually after the webinar. Then there's another question of Johan. Is there any permit required for a technician going to the UK for repair or installation of equipment during a limited period of 1 up to 3 weeks?
The duration is not relevant, it's the nature of the activity. So the UK government would consider the nature of the activity, even for an afternoon, relevant regardless. So it doesn't matter if you're conducting a work activity for 15 minutes or for 15 days, it's the nature of that activity. There are provisions that I alluded to in the business visitor rules that allow for installation where there is a contract in place. I can't confirm specifically without that oversight, but potentially that would be one of the concessions that would enable that individual to do so as a visitor, but it would depend on the arrangement in place.
Mm-hmm. Then Joseph has the same question as Johan, but we actually answered it already. Then there's a question of Chris. Is there a biometric appointment needed for the GBM route as well?
Yes, so it depends again on nationality as to whether or not you can utilise the digital application process or you need to attend a biometric appointment. But biometric submission for all visa applications is mandatory, regardless of route. So that happens even for visitors. It's just dependent on whether or not you can benefit from the digital application process or not.
Okay, thank you. And the next question of Yuri. Can a Belgian construction company obtain a service supplier visa for their skilled workers to execute construction works in the UK?
Potentially. Again, it's a very broad category with very specific circumstances. Service suppliers usually have to be governed by an overarching trade agreement. So we would need to look at the nature of the activity to confirm whether or not it could fit under one of the permitted routes before I could advise specifically. But there is some flexibility in that if your work is covered by an overarching trade agreement.
Okay, thank you. So I'm aware. So as already said at the start, a lot of these questions are really company specific. So for all people or companies in the call who have really specific questions, it would be useful if you come back to us with a specific explanation and a description of the situation of your company, also the relationship with your British clients, who performs the works, how many people have to go to the UK to perform the work. So all this information is crucial to give a really detailed answer on your questions. We have a last question of Eve. Who asks, who has to request the visa when sending a subcontractor to perform labor?
So it would depend. The individual is responsible for making their own visa application, but if you're looking at a sponsored visa route to provide services in the UK, then they would need their corporate sponsor to first issue the certificate of sponsorship. So again, depending on the arrangement in place, most of these practically are driven by our clients. So we would receive an instruction from a business or a company that's on our books, so to speak, to support their individual with the visa application, and we would manage it end to end. So we would help the company secure the certificate of sponsorship and the work permit, and then we would prepare the visa application for the individual and send the individual to their appointment to complete that process. but depending on the service model, it can be compartmentalized, and you could just issue a certificate of sponsorship and the individual could then be responsible for the visa application. So it does depend on your structure and on the visa route as to who drives which part. And obviously personal visa routes are usually driven by the individual, but can be supported financially by an employer if that's applicable.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think we've had all the questions for Charlotte. There's still one question in Dutch, but I will take this away afterwards. I first want to thank Charlotte for the presentation. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions that will follow after the presentation, but thank you for giving us a detailed overview of all the possibilities. And then I will close the webinar in Dutch. So thank you very much, and see and hear you later.
See you. Thank you again.
Bye. Dus we hebben nog een laatste vraag van Mieke over de Brexit-subsidies. Dus die subsidies die lopen tot de middelen uitgeput zijn. De volgende oproep die loopt tot 12 april. Maar er zal waarschijnlijk nog een volgen. Daarvoor zijn de data wel nog niet bekend. Maar dus die subsidies die lopen tot de middelen uitgeput zijn. En voilà, dan hebben we de laatste vraag voor deze sessie. Zoals al gezegd in het Engels hier net, die vragen omtrent de verschillende mogelijkheden over de visa, die zijn heel bedrijfsspecifiek en het antwoord hangt echt af van elke individuele situatie. Dus als u uw vraag nog niet voldoende geantwoord heeft gekregen in deze sessie, dan zou ik u willen vragen om uw specifieke vraag nog eens op mail te zetten, met daar echt zoveel mogelijk in detail informatie bij over het contract dat u heeft met de Britse klant, over welk type werken u daar gaat uitvoeren, wie die werken gaat uitvoeren, hoe lang dat zou duren en nog andere informatie die voor ons nuttig kan zijn om uw antwoord zo goed mogelijk te beantwoorden. Jullie zien het e-mailadres op de slide staan, dus dat is brexit@fitagency.be. En dan rest er mij alleen nog maar jullie nog eens te bedanken om deze sessie mee te volgen. En dan hopelijk nog tot een volgende keer. Dag!